Have you heard of the 56-day showdown that toppled an empire? March 13, 1954, deep in the mountains of Vietnam, Vietnamese fighters unleashed a storm of artillery on the seemingly invincible French fortress of Dien Bien Phu. Through pounding rain and mud, they hauled heavy cannons over cliffs and dug a maze of trenches, inching closer each night. 56 days later, the fortress crumbled. That single victory ended French colonial rule in Indochina and lit a fire of independence across Asia, Africa, and beyond, proof that a determined nation could shake the world. The winter of 1953 was fading, but the chill of war still clung to the mountains of northwest Vietnam. Across Indochina, the First Indochina War had dragged on for nearly 8 brutal years, wearing down soldiers and civilians alike. Both the French Expeditionary Corps and the Viet Minh were searching for a decisive blow, one that could break the stalemate and end the bloodletting. Far from the coastal cities and crowded deltas lay a remote valley ringed by steep, forested hills, Dien Bien Phu. To French planners in Hanoi and Paris, it was more than a name on a map. It was a natural fortress, isolated, strategically placed near the borders of Laos and China, and seemingly perfect for drawing the Viet Minh into a conventional battle. The French commander, General Henry Navarre, believed he could lure his elusive enemy into the open, where French firepower and air support would crush them. His staff boasted that a well-supplied garrison of paratroopers, dug in behind barbed wire and reinforced bunkers, could withstand any assault. But beyond those narrow ridges, another plan was taking shape. In the jungled highlands, General V Nguyen Giap studied every contour of the valley. He saw not an impregnable fortress, but a trap, one that could be turned against its builders. With methodical patience, he and the Viet Minh prepared to surround and isolate the French stronghold. Tens of thousands of porters hauled heavy artillery piece by piece through rugged mountains and treacherous trails, their footsteps muffled in the mist. Day and night, under the cover of dense foliage, guns crept closer. By early 1954, the stage was set. In the West, diplomats debated and intelligence analysts watched nervously, sensing that a single confrontation might determine the future of Indochina. Inside the valley, French soldiers manned their posts with a confidence born of modern weaponry and aerial supremacy. Yet above them, hidden in the dark folds of the hills, the Viet Minh's silent guns were already aimed and waiting. The storm that would shatter colonial ambitions and shock the world was about to break. The calm of the Dien Bien Valley in early 1954 was an illusion. Beneath the green hills and quiet rice paddies, two opposing visions of war were converging. For the French, the valley was a fortress in the making. For the Viet Minh, it was the site of a meticulously planned trap, one that demanded months of relentless preparation. General Henry Navarre, newly appointed commander of French forces in Indochina, arrived with orders to secure a military and political advantage before negotiations could force an end to the war. He believed that a decisive conventional battle would cripple the Viet Minh and restore France's bargaining power. Dien Bien Phu, a remote basin near the Laotian border, seemed ideal. From late 1953, French paratroopers descended into the valley, establishing a sprawling complex of fortified positions. They named their strongpoints after women: Him Lam Beatrice, Gclpp Gabrielle, Hun Sissim Isabel, and many more, each ringed with barbed wire, trenches, and interlocking fields of fire. Engineers carved an airstrip across the valley floor at Magung Than, the lifeline through which supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements could be flown in from Hanoi. French commanders were confident. They boasted of heavy artillery, tanks, and air superiority. The garrison, nearly 16,000 strong and well armed with mortar and machine guns, was supported by squadrons of fighters and bombers. Surrounded by steep hills, the valley looked like a natural fortress, and Navarre was certain the Viet Minh would be lured into a frontal assault, only to be annihilated by concentrated firepower. The French plan hinged on a single assumption: that the Viet Minh lacked the capacity to transport and position heavy artillery in the rugged terrain. "No enemy guns can reach us here," officers assured their men. It was a miscalculation that would prove fatal. Far from the valley floor, General V. Nguyen Giap read the French intentions with cold clarity. He understood that Dien Bien Phu could be both opportunity and peril. A hasty attack might waste lives. A patient siege could choke the fortress. In December 1953, the Viet Minh High Command convened to decide the strategy. Giap initially considered a swift strike, Han Nan, Thing Nan, or fight fast, win fast, but the odds were perilous. French fortifications were strong and their air power overwhelming. After days of reflection and reconnaissance, Giap made the bold decision to adopt Han Cheek, Tin Cheek, a slow, methodical approach. Dig in, isolate the enemy, and destroy them step by step. That decision launched one of the most remarkable logistical efforts in modern warfare. Tens of thousands of civilian porters, many of them peasants and teenagers, became the arteries of the campaign. Armed with little more than determination and bamboo-carrying poles, they moved food, ammunition, and artillery parts across hundreds of kilometers of jungle trails and sheer mountain passes. Artillery regiments dismantled heavy 105mm guns and hauled them, piece by piece, through mud and mist. Entire hillsides were carved into hidden emplacements, the barrels carefully camouflaged with branches and foliage. Under cover of night, sappers dug elaborate trench systems that snaked ever closer to the French positions. The network of roads, tunnels, and gun pits grew with almost surgical precision. Behind the front lines, the entire Viet Minh war machine pulsed with a single goal. Villages across northern Vietnam contributed rice, salt, and labor. Women carried ammunition baskets. Children collected scrap metal for weapons. From the Politburo in Hanoi to the smallest hamlet, the cry was the same: TTC Cho Tuyen Tuyen, TTC Ji Chen Thing. Everything for the front, everything for victory. The effort stretched human endurance. Porters trudged through freezing rain and leech-filled swamps, surviving on meager rations. Many walked barefoot, their shoulders bruised by the weight of shells and rice sacks. Yet the flow of supplies never ceased. To them, the struggle was larger than hardship. It was the promise of independence after nearly a century of colonial rule. By February 1954, Giap's forces, nearly 50,000 combat troops, supported by over 60,000 porters and laborers, had encircled the valley. French patrols occasionally glimpsed movement in the distant hills, but failed to grasp the scale of what was coming. From their bunkers, French officers observed quiet ridgelines, unaware that well-camouflaged gun barrels were already trained on their airstrip and command posts. As winter gave way to spring, the contrast between the two armies sharpened. Inside the valley, French soldiers played cards and wrote letters home, reassured by their commander's confidence. Beyond the hills, the Viet Minh moved with tireless discipline. Invisible yet ever closer, the preparations were nearly complete. What the French imagined as a luring trap was in fact a carefully woven snare, and the first rumble of guns would soon reveal just how thoroughly General Giap had turned their fortress against them. The night of March 13, 1954, descended over the Dien Bien Valley with an uneasy stillness. A damp mist clung to the trenches, and the only sounds were the distant murmur of jungle insects and the occasional cough from a sentry. French soldiers on watch scanned the dark ridgelines, seeing nothing but black silhouettes of hills against a moonless sky. Then, at exactly 5 p.m., the silence shattered. A thunderous barrage erupted from the surrounding heights, the likes of which the French had never imagined possible. Heavy 105mm shells screamed through the night, slamming into the Him Lam strongpoint codenamed Beatrice by the French. The valley shook as explosions ripped through bunkers and barbed wire. Flames leapt skyward, turning the evening into a flickering inferno. French officers, stunned by the sheer volume and accuracy of the artillery, scrambled to respond. They had believed the Viet Minh incapable of positioning heavy guns in the steep mountains. Yet, hidden in cleverly camouflaged bunkers, Giap's artillery units unleashed a meticulously coordinated assault. Each shot was calculated, every target command posts, gun pits. The Magung Than airstrip precisely plotted over weeks of reconnaissance. Inside Beatrice, Major Paul Paget tried to rally his men, shouting orders above the cacophony. But communication lines were shredded, and defensive positions crumbled under relentless fire. Viet Minh infantry surged forward through trenches and bamboo-covered saps, closing the distance under the protective roar of their own artillery. By midnight, Beatrice was engulfed. French counterattacks faltered as mortar rained down. By the early hours of March 14th, the strongpoint was silent, its defenders dead, wounded, or captured. The seemingly unassailable outer ring of the French fortress had been breached in a single night. French command reeled. Only a day later, on the evening of March 14th, the Viet Minh shifted their assault north to the Gisil Peep strongpoint. Codenamed Gabrielle, General Christian de Castries, the garrison commander, ordered fierce counter-barrages and summoned reinforcements by air. But the relentless shelling made the runway at Magung Than nearly unusable. Supplies and reinforcements arrived sporadically, each aircraft braving deadly anti-aircraft fire. As darkness fell, Viet Minh artillery pounded Gabrielle with an intensity that dwarfed the previous night. French defenders, many of them North African troops hardened by years of colonial fighting, dug in and returned fire, but their guns were soon silenced one by one. The attackers moved forward behind rolling barrages, their bugles cutting through the smoke and thunder. By dawn on March 15th, Gabrielle lay in ruins. Survivors staggered back toward the central positions, their faces hollow with shock. The French perimeter was shrinking rapidly, and morale throughout the valley plummeted. The Viet Minh wasted no time consolidating their gains. On March 17th, they struck again, this time at the small outpost of Ban Kio, held by a garrison of local Thai troops loyal to the French. Weary from the constant bombardment and shaken by the swift defeats of Beatrice and Gabrielle, the defenders offered only brief resistance before withdrawing. With Ban Kio captured, the northern approach to Dien Bien Phu was fully under Viet Minh control. From the surrounding hills, Giap's artillery now commanded a clear line of fire under the valley floor and the all-important Magung Than airstrip. French engineers worked frantically to repair bomb craters, but transport aircraft were increasingly forced to drop supplies by parachute, many of which fell into Viet Minh-held territory. In less than a week, 3 key strongpoints had fallen. What the French High Command had envisioned as a trap for the Viet Minh was rapidly becoming a death pit for their own troops. General Navarre, monitoring from Hanoi, was stunned by the ferocity of the assault and the devastating effectiveness of Viet Minh artillery. The myth of French air and fire superiority crumbled as pilots reported deadly anti-aircraft zones and ground crews struggled to keep the battered airstrip operational. Inside the valley, de Castries faced a grim reality. The outer defensive belt, meant to keep the enemy at a safe distance, was gone. The Viet Minh trenches crept closer each night, their digging audible to nervous sentries in the darkness. Soldiers who once joked about an easy victory now whispered about encirclement and annihilation. For the Viet Minh, the opening phase exceeded expectations. Weeks of preparation had paid off in stunning fashion. Artillery crews, hidden in hillside bunkers that seemed to grow from the earth itself, had proven that careful planning and sheer human endurance could outmatch modern technology. As March 17th drew to a close, the battlefield bore the scars of the first strikes: shattered bunkers, smoking craters, and the acrid scent of cordite drifting across the valley. French command posts flickered with urgent messages to Hanoi and Paris. But reinforcements were days, if not impossible, away. The siege had truly begun. What was meant to be a display of French strength had turned almost overnight into a desperate fight for survival. And for General Giap, the success of the opening phase was only the beginning. The noose around Dien Bien Phu was tightening, and the next stage of the battle promised even greater ferocity. By the final days of March 1954, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu had already endured 2 weeks of relentless pressure. The once confident fortress now resembled a scarred and battered island, its perimeter shrinking beneath the Viet Minh's tightening grip. Yet the most punishing phase of the siege was still to come. General V Nguyen Giap, emboldened by early successes, prepared to break through the heart of the French defenses and choke the life from the Valley d'At after the rapid collapse of the outer strongpoints. Beatrice, Gabriel, and Ban Kio French commander Christian de Castries consolidated his remaining forces around a central cluster of fortifications near the Mai Gung Than airstrip. These key positions formed a rough horseshoe of interconnected bunkers and trench lines, each named with an alphabetical code, A1, C1, D1, and E2, among others. Together, they shielded the command post, the supply depots, and the crucial airstrip that kept the garrison alive. De Castries still believed in holding the valley. Reinforcements and supplies, however sporadic, were being dropped by parachute. American transport aircraft braved the anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition, food, and medical supplies. French artillery remained formidable, and the soldiers, North Africans, legionnaires, and local auxiliaries dug deeper, reinforced bunkers, and prepared for what they knew would be a massive assault. GIAP, meanwhile, continued his methodical advance. His engineers extended zigzagging trench systems toward the very heart of the French lines. Under cover of darkness, Viet Minh sappers dug forward a few meters each night, their progress marked by the faint scrape of shovels that French sentries could hear but rarely locate. By late March, these approach trenches were close enough for a new offensive. At dusk on March 30th, the quiet valley once again erupted in fire. Viet Minh artillery, concealed in the surrounding hills, launched an unprecedented barrage on the central positions. Shells rained down on strongpoints E1 and E2, while mortar pounded A1 and D1. French communications were disrupted as telephone lines snapped under the concussions. The airstrip, already cratered from earlier attacks, became a blazing ruin of smashed equipment and torn earth. Under the cover of this thunder, Viet Minh infantry surged forward. Waves of assault troops advanced behind rolling barrages, slipping through gaps in the wire as engineers detonated explosives to clear paths. The French defenders, stunned but determined, returned fire with machine guns and mortar. The night sky flickered with muzzle flashes, tracer rounds, and the sharp glow of flares. The fight for the E positions was fierce and immediate. By dawn of March 31st, Viet Minh forces had overrun E1 and E2 after brutal close-quarters combat. Grenades and bayonets decided the outcome inside the narrow trenches, where smoke and screams mingled in the choking darkness. French survivors fell back toward D1, leaving behind shattered bunkers and the dead of both armies. Attention then shifted to the other key outposts, A1 and D1, whose capture would bring the Viet Minh within striking distance of the French command center itself. Strongpoint A1, a steep hill rising above the valley floor, was the most critical. Whoever held it controlled a vantage point for artillery observation and dominated the central basin. De Castries knew it had to be held at all costs. The Viet Minh knew it had to be taken. Beginning the night of March 31st, Giap threw wave after wave of fighters against A1. Each charge was met with a wall of machine gun fire and exploding shells. French paratroopers and foreign legionnaires fought from reinforced trenches, launching desperate counterattacks and even hand-to-hand assaults to reclaim lost ground. the hill became a furnace of violence. Rain mixed with dust and blood, turning the earth into a slick red mire. Artillery shells from both sides chewed the slopes into a maze of craters and collapsed dugouts. Viet Minh sappers dug tunnels beneath the defenses, attempting to plant explosives under French bunkers, while defenders used grenades and flamethrowers to repel them. For days, the struggle raged without pause. Viet Minh soldiers attacked in darkness, their bugles signaling fresh waves, while French flares lit the battlefield in an eerie glow. Casualties mounted horrifically. Entire companies were annihilated in the mud and barbed wire, but neither side relented. Above the carnage, the French Air Force fought a losing battle. Anti-aircraft guns hidden in the hills made each supply flight a deadly gamble. Parachuted crates often fell into Viet Minh-held territory, and attempts to repair the runway proved futile under constant shellfire. Wounded soldiers crowded field hospitals, where overworked medics struggled with dwindling supplies. Food rations shrank. Water grew scarce. The garrison's isolation deepened. Each day brought more losses of territory and men, while the Viet Minh trenches crept ever closer. French morale began to fray under the unending bombardment and the realization that outside, rescue might never come. Despite the relentless onslaught, the French clung to their core positions. On April 3rd and 4th, counterattacks were launched to retake parts of A1 and D1. Some succeeded briefly, only to be reversed by Viet Minh counterstrikes. The defenders, often fighting from crater to crater, showed remarkable tenacity, but every victory was fleeting and costly. General de Castries requested additional paratroop reinforcements, and small groups were dropped into the valley. But these fresh troops could do little to alter the strategic reality. The Viet Minh continued to extend their trench networks and stockpile ammunition for the next phase. By April 4th, the central sector of the French fortress was a shattered landscape of burnt timber, mangled wire, and unburied dead. Strong points E1 and E2 were lost. D1 was heavily damaged and barely defensible. A1 remained in French hands, but only at a staggering cost and under constant threat. For the Viet Minh, this phase was a critical success. They had breached the inner defensive ring, captured key high ground, and rendered the airstrip virtually useless. French artillery positions were steadily neutralized, and the garrison was now completely dependent on airdrops for survival. Appy, careful and deliberate, did not rush. He tightened the noose with patient precision, confident that time, attrition, and unyielding pressure would break the enemy. His troops, though bloodied, remained resolute. Encouraged by tangible progress and the knowledge that the French fortress was bleeding out. As the smoke of early April drifted over the valley, Dien Bien Phu had become a vision of hell. Craters gaped like open wounds. The air stank of cordite and decay. The once proud bastion of French power in Indochina was reduced to a labyrinth of mud, rubble, and despair. Yet the most decisive blows were still to fall. The stage was set for the climactic assault that would seal the fate of the fortress and, with it, the future of an empire. The month of April bled into May with a tense, ominous stillness over Dien Bien Phu. After weeks of brutal fighting, the valley had become a wasteland of shattered bunkers and mud-slick craters. French soldiers clung to their remaining strongpoints, most of them little more than smoking ruins, while the Viet Minh tightened a noose of trenches and artillery around them. General Viet Minh Giap, patient and calculating, was ready for the decisive blow that would end the siege and break French colonial power in Indochina. By late April, the French garrison was a fortress in name only. The airstrip at Ngang Than was completely unusable. Supply drops often fell into Viet Minh territory or were destroyed by fire before they could be retrieved. Food was scarce, medical supplies nearly exhausted, and ammunition running low. Soldiers survived on half rations, and the wounded lay in overcrowded. Makeshift hospitals where doctors worked by the dim glow of lanterns and candles. Morale was brittle. Letters from home arrived sporadically, if at all, and rumors spread that American or British intervention might soon break the siege. But each day without rescue deepened the sense of isolation. General Christian de Castries and his staff still issued calm communiques. But the men in the trenches could hear the Viet Minh shovels at night, inching closer, and knew the end was approaching. On the surrounding hills, Viet Minh forces now numbered close to 50,000, supported by an army of porters who kept the guns supplied. Their trench network resembled a massive spider's web, stretching to within grenade-throwing distance of the French lines. Giap's plan was deliberate: sap the enemy's strength, sever their supply lines, and then crush them in a final storm at dusk on May 1st. The Viet Minh unleashed their heaviest artillery bombardment of the siege. From concealed positions, hundreds of guns poured fire onto the French central sector. The earth convulsed under the impact. Bunkers collapsed. Ammunition dumps exploded in towering columns of flame. The roar of shells merged into a continuous thunder that shook the valley. Infantry attacks followed swiftly. Strong points Huguet and Dominique, already weakened by weeks of pounding, were assaulted by wave after wave of Viet Minh troops. French defenders fought desperately, firing until their gun barrels glowed red. But the attackers came on relentlessly, digging forward, hurling grenades, and overwhelming positions in hand-to-hand combat. By dawn on May 2nd, Dominique had fallen. Huguet, after repeated counterattacks, was finally abandoned. The French perimeter shrank further, leaving only a handful of isolated outposts, a one Isabelle, and a few others standing between the garrison and total collapse. The hill known as A1, or Eliane II to the French, became the focal point of the final offensive. Towering over the valley floor, A1 provided a commanding view of the remaining French positions. Whoever held it controlled the battle's outcome. The French had reinforced A1 with labyrinthine trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire. Paratroopers and foreign legionnaires, exhausted but resolute, braced for the assault they knew was inevitable. The Viet Minh had learned from earlier failures and now prepared a decisive strike. Under cover of night on May 6th, Viet Minh sappers completed a secret tunnel beneath the hill. They packed it with nearly a ton of explosives. As evening fell, the tunnel charge was detonated with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of earth and fire skyward and tearing a massive crater into the heart of the French defenses. Shocked defenders staggered as Viet Minh infantry surged through the breach. The battle raged for hours in choking smoke and swirling dust. Grenades and bayonets ruled the cratered slopes. French soldiers counterattacked again and again, but the attackers were relentless. By dawn on May 7th, the tricolor flag over A1 was gone. The key to the valley, the heart of the fortress. As one French officer called, it was lost. Far to the south, the isolated strongpoint of Isabelle attempted to hold out. Cut off from the main garrison, its 1,800 men had endured weeks of siege with dwindling supplies. On the night of May 6th, Viet Minh artillery pounded Isabelle with unprecedented ferocity, smashing bunkers and cutting communications. Realizing that the central fortress was doomed, the Isabelle garrison attempted a breakout shortly after midnight on May 7th, hoping to fight through the surrounding lines and escape into the jungle. Viet Minh forces were ready. Mortar and machine guns tore into the fleeing column, inflicting heavy casualties. Only a handful of survivors managed to slip through to friendly territory. At the Magung Fan command post, General de Castries faced the inevitable. Communications with Hanoi were sporadic, reinforcements impossible. By the morning of May 7th, the Viet Minh had overrun nearly every major strongpoint, and their trenches were at the very edge of the command bunker itself. French officers moved among their men, offering words of encouragement, but most soldiers sat silently in the mud. rifles across their knees, waiting for the final assault. Shells continued to fall, and the ground trembled under the pounding of artillery. Inside the headquarters dugout, de Castries drafted a final message to Hanoi, acknowledging the hopelessness of further resistance. Shortly after 5 p.m. on May 7th, Giap ordered the final assault. Viet Minh units swarmed over the last French trenches, their bugles blaring through smoke and thunder. Grenades and small arms fire echoed across the shattered valley. The French defenders, many wounded and out of ammunition, offered only scattered resistance. By early evening, Viet Minh troops surrounded the Magung Than command bunker. De Castries, pale and exhausted, emerged with his staff to surrender. The once proud fortress of Dien Bien Phu was silent, except for the crackle of fires and the distant cheers of victorious soldiers. The scale of the French defeat was staggering. Of the nearly 16,000 men who had garrisoned the valley, more than 11,000 were taken prisoner, including de Castries and his entire staff. Thousands lay dead or dying amid the ruins. French aircraft circled helplessly overhead, unable to land or even accurately drop supplies as Viet Minh. Flags rose over the valley. News of the victory electrified the Viet Minh and reverberated around the world. After nearly a decade of colonial war, a revolutionary army of peasants and guerrillas had annihilated a modern European expeditionary force. Dien Bien Phu became a symbol of anti-colonial resistance and a clarion call for independence movements across Asia and Africa. In Paris, shock and dismay gave way to political crisis. The French government, already weary of the costly conflict, now faced the undeniable collapse of its Indochina strategy. Negotiations that had begun in Geneva accelerated, and within months, the Geneva Accords would end the First Indochina War. Dividing Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel, the fall of Dien Bien Phu was more than a military defeat. It was the shattering of an empire's illusion of invincibility. General Giap's combination of patient strategy, mass mobilization, and relentless pressure had overcome superior firepower and technology. The battle demonstrated that a determined nationalist movement, armed with discipline and popular support, could defeat a colonial power on the battlefield. For the French soldiers who survived, the memory of those final days, muddy trenches, ceaseless bombardment, the sound of approaching bugles would never fade. For the Viet Minh, the victory was both triumph and testament to years of sacrifice by countless civilians who carried shells through mountain passes, dug endless trenches, and endured unimaginable hardship for independence. As night fell on May 7, 1954, the valley that had once been a quiet farming basin was transformed into a monument to courage and endurance. Smoke curled from cratered hillsides. The stench of gunpowder and damp earth hung heavy in the air. Amid the wreckage, Viet Minh soldiers raised their flags and buried their dead, while captured French troops sat in stunned silence. Dien Bien Phu was no longer merely a place on a map. It had become a legend and epic of resistance that changed the course of Vietnamese history and sent ripples through the entire colonial world. When the guns finally fell silent on the evening of May 7, 1954, the valley of Dien Bien Phu lay in ruin. Smoke rose from shattered bunkers and scorched hillsides, mingling with the heavy scent of mud, cordite, and loss. The Viet Minh flag fluttered above Magung Than, signaling not only the end of a grueling 56-day siege, but also the collapse of France's colonial ambitions in Indochina. The consequences of this single battle would echo far beyond the mountains of northwest Vietnam. For France, the defeat was nothing short of catastrophic. Nearly 16,000 soldiers had manned the fortress when the siege began. By its end, more than 11,000 were prisoners, and thousands lay dead or wounded. Entire battalions of elite troops, foreign legionnaires, paratroopers, and North African regiments had been annihilated. The psychological impact in Paris was profound. For years, French leaders had clung to the belief that superior firepower and Western technology could preserve their colonial empire. Dien Bien Phu destroyed that illusion in a single campaign. Newspapers across Europe carried headlines of disaster, humiliation, and the end of an era. Public opinion, already weary of a costly and unpopular war, turned sharply against further involvement in Indochina. Political shockwaves soon followed. The French government, facing a mounting crisis at home, recognized that the war was no longer winnable. Negotiations already underway in Geneva gained new urgency. Just 2 months later, France signed the Geneva Accords, agreeing to withdraw from Vietnam and effectively ending nearly a century of colonial rule in the region. For the Viet Minh, Dien Bien Phu was both a military victory and a powerful symbol of national determination. General Viet Minh Giap's strategy, combining meticulous planning, mass mobilization, and relentless siege tactics, had overcome an opponent with far greater resources and modern weaponry. The triumph validated years of sacrifice by soldiers and civilians alike. The porters who carried artillery through mountains, the peasants who dug endless trenches, the fighters who faced tanks and bombers with little more than courage and discipline. The victory transformed the Viet Minh from a guerrilla movement into a recognized national force. At the Geneva Conference, representatives of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam negotiated from a position of strength, gaining international acknowledgement of Vietnam's independence and a temporary division of the country at the 17th parallel. While this division would set the stage for future conflict, the immediate result was clear. The colonial era in Vietnam was finished. Dien Bien Phu's significance extended well beyond Southeast Asia. Around the world, colonized peoples watched in astonishment as a peasant army defeated a modern European power. Independence movements from Algeria to sub-Saharan Africa drew inspiration from the battle, seeing in it proof that colonial empires were not invincible. In Washington, London, and Moscow, policymakers reassessed the balance of power in Asia. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, increased its support for the anti-communist government in South Vietnam, a commitment that would ultimately draw America into its own long and costly war. The Soviet Union and China, meanwhile, saw the Viet Minh victory as a validation of revolutionary struggle and pledged continued support. Military strategists also studied the battle with keen interest. Giap's combination of protracted siege tactics and people-powered logistics demonstrated that industrial-era armies could be defeated by an opponent with less technology but superior organization, morale, and local support. The concept of people's war, already influential in communist theory, gained new credibility as a practical doctrine. Behind the geopolitical shifts lay immense human suffering. Villagers in the surrounding countryside had endured weeks of bombardment, and thousands of both French and Vietnamese soldiers were dead or maimed. For survivors, the memories were seared into body and spirit. The endless mud, the roar of artillery, the cries of the wounded in collapsing trenches. French prisoners marched for days to remote camps, many succumbing to illness and exhaustion. Vietnamese families mourned sons and daughters lost in the siege, even as they celebrated independence. The valley itself remained scarred, a landscape of cratered hillsides and unmarked graves. Yet amid the tragedy, the battle became a powerful national narrative for Vietnam. It was remembered not only as a military triumph, but as a testament to collective resolve, the ability of an oppressed people to endure unimaginable hardship for freedom. Each year, commemorations in Vietnam honor the fighters and civilians whose sacrifice reshaped their country's destiny. Dien Bien Phu marked the twilight of European colonialism in Asia. It signaled to the world that the age of empire was ending and that nationalist movements, if united and determined, could overcome even the mightiest colonial armies. The victory set the stage for the eventual reunification of Vietnam and influenced anti-colonial struggles across the globe. For France, the defeat prompted a painful re-evaluation of its global role. Within a decade, the country faced similar challenges in Algeria, where independence movements invoked the spirit of Dien Bien Phu as they fought French rule. The battle thus became a cautionary symbol of the limits of military force in the face of popular resistance. When the smoke cleared and the last prisoners were marched away, the valley of Dien Bien Phu stood as more than a battlefield. It was a milestone in 20th century history, a vivid lesson in the power of human will against colonial domination. From the muddy trenches where exhausted soldiers surrendered to the negotiating tables in Geneva, the echoes of that victory shaped not just Vietnam's future, but the destiny of nations far beyond its misty hills. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu stands as a defining moment in 20th century history, a clash where determination and strategy overcame advanced weaponry and colonial might. Over 56 relentless days, the Viet Minh transformed a remote valley into the graveyard of French imperial ambitions. Through meticulous planning, relentless logistics, and the courage of tens of fighters and civilians, General Viet Minh achieved what many in the world considered impossible: the defeat of a modern, European army by a people's army sustained by sheer resolve. Its impact reached far beyond Vietnam's mist-shrouded hills. France's decisive loss hastened the end of its Indochina Empire and set a precedent that emboldened independence movements across Asia and Africa. At the same time, it reshaped global geopolitics, drawing new powers into the region and setting the stage for the long, complex conflict that would follow. Yet Dien Bien Phu is remembered, not only for its military brilliance but also for its human story of sacrifice, endurance, and an unyielding desire for self-determination. The battle remains a powerful reminder that even the most formidable empire can be undone when a nation unites around the pursuit of freedom and the right to shape its own destiny.